Good afternoon to our listeners on Parliament Radio 105.5 FM, our viewers on the Parliament channel, and those of you joining us on the World Wide Web via the Parliament's website, www.ttparliament.org. We welcome you to our coverage of today's sitting of the House of Representatives, which is set to begin in just some 20 seconds' time. As indicated in our House notes, there are some 3 papers to be laid. Prime Minister's question time takes place today. There are 7 urgent questions and 7 questions qualified for oral answer, and debate is expected to continue on the Miscellaneous Provisions Marriage Bill. We take you over now to the chamber.
Speaker.
We welcome you to the 38th sitting of the House in the second session of the 11th Parliament that takes place on Friday, June 9th, 2017.
Almighty God, we give thanks to you, the Creator of the universe, and humbly beseech you to direct and prosper the deliberations of the members of this House here assembled for the advancement of your glory and the trust and welfare of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Grant that peace and happiness, truth and justice may be established among us for all generations. Amen, Amen, Namaste.
Oath or affirmation, announcements by the Speaker.
Honorable members, the following members have asked to be excused from today's sitting of the House. The Honorable Major General Retired Edmund Dillon, MP, member for Point Fortin. Dr. Lakram Bodo, MP, member for Faizabad. Mrs. Christine Nualo Hussein, MP, member for Kumuta Manzanilla. The Honorable Maxi Kafi, MP, member for La Hokata Talparu. And Mr. Prakash Ramada, MP, member for St. Augustine. The leave which the members seek is granted.
Bills brought from the Senate on the supplemental order paper, the Motor Vehicles and Road Traffic Amendment Bill 2017 in the name of the Attorney General. Petitions, papers.
Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, I have the honor to lay the following papers. Papers number 1 to 2. The audited financial statements of the Trinidad and Tobago Solid Waste Management Company Limited for the financial years ended September 30th, 2014 and 2015. I beg to move that papers 1 to 2 be referred to the Public Accounts Committee.
Honorable members, the question is that papers 1 to 2 be referred to the Public Accounts Committee. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. Member for Laventille West.
Madam Speaker, I have the honor to lay on the table the following paper. The delegation report of the International Parliamentary Conference on National Security and Cybersecurity Day held in London, United Kingdom from March the 27th to March the 31st, 2017. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Reports from committees.
Member for Port of Spain South.
Madam Speaker, I have the honor to present the following report. the first report of the Joint Select Committee on Foreign Affairs, second session, 11 Parliament, on the public examination of the draft summary of recommendations and conclusions of the 41st meeting of the Council for Trade and Economic Development. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Prime Minister's questions.
Member for Chaguanas West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question number 1 to the Honourable Prime Minister. In light of the Prime Minister's recent commute on the ferry service, could the Prime Minister state his findings and recommendations, if any, that arose from his experience?
Prime Minister.
Madam Speaker, I trust that my colleague from Chaguanas West does not think that this commute to Tobago is an unusual action on my part. However, Madam Speaker, last Sunday I took a trip to Tobago on the Express, and among my findings is that the ferry has a built capacity for, if all 4 engines are operational, the trip to Tobago could be in the order of 3.5 hours. If perchance those 4 engines aren't operational and it's running on 3 engines, it can do the trip in 4 hours or thereabouts. And if, of course, there are only 2 engines operating, then the trip would take 5.5 hours. But the ferry can travel on 2 engines. On the day when I traveled on Sunday last, 2 engines were operational from the trip from Port of Spain to Scarborough. And that was understood before we left. So on a 2-engine driven ferry, we left Port of Spain at 4 o'clock and arrived in Tobago at 9:20. However, Madam Speaker, this was not entirely news to me because it has been known to the national community that we have been having considerable difficulty with the ferry service, largely as a result of a rash of breakdowns and indications of poor maintenance. And it came to my attention that the ferry had skipped its dry docking arrangements at an earlier time, and arrangements were not in place for the proper maintenance. But more shockingly, I discovered in conversation with the management of the port is that for the last 11 years, we had hired operators of the ferry service. And when at the end of the 11-year period, that arrangement was changed to local management, I was told by the port that one of the difficulties we are facing now with respect to these breakdowns and response to the ferry service maintenance and so on, is that the port does not have under its control or access to the maintenance record of these ferries for the last 11 years, meaning that while the port hired help to run the service, no arrangement was made to bring the maintenance data into an archive or control of the port. So now that we've made the changes, we are now in a situation where we have to literally begin to build a record of maintenance and service from the ferries. Now that is an unacceptable state of affairs, and what the government has done in the face of the difficulties we are undergoing now, particularly people of Tobago, is that we have had to go back now to the manufacturers to send technical people to us with these ferries as we make arrangements to put the 2 ferries on dry docking, which is long overdue. I've read a report which has shown a series of operational difficulties with the ferry, some of them quite serious, with respect to the steering gear and the introduction of water into the system that shouldn't be there and so on. The bottom line is that our 2 ferries, the Express and the Spirit, require urgent and extensive overhaul, and against that background, the government has taken steps to authorize the port to find an interim vessel, which they are working on, and the port will speak on that in the future. But there's in answer to the question further as to what is being contemplated. It is clear to me that the relevant information that is required for proper operation of the port and some of the systems in the port, including management and other kinds of systems, require serious overhaul, and there's some significant difficulty in getting the relevant information in the port. And as a result of that, I am contemplating asking the Minister of Transport to put into the port an investigative team to understand exactly what is going on in the port with respect to the ferry service, and in keeping with the intention to have the THA and Tobagoans involved in it, we will review the whole operation of the ferry service, and that I will say further, the Minister of Works will announce in due course what action will be taken with respect to understanding the details of the problems that plague the port.
Might I, before I call on the next supplementary, might I just recommend that we try to keep response to 2 minutes in order for us to see how we deal with the paper. Member for Tabuikit.
Madam Speaker. Honourable Prime Minister, I'm very happy to hear that you are going to put an investigative team to look at the history of what has happened to the ferry service. But at the same time, I would like to ask the port, okay, but I want to focus on the ferry service in this instance. Was anyone at all in the port identified as having the responsibility to directly oversee over these years the elements of the contract with Bay Ferries? And if so, are you going to ask the port to take disciplinary action at the level it ought to be taken with respect to the what I consider not proper supervision of this particular contract, the details of which would be well known?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, that question is embodied in the assignment of the new board of the port, which is looking at that and similar matters.
For Puchis.
Madam Speaker, today, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, are you satisfied that going back to the manufacturer, the builder of these vessels is the best course of action, as opposed to retaining a new or another maintenance contractor that can be available on a regular basis to supervise the maintenance of these vessels?
Yes, sir.
Under the situation that exists now, we are satisfied that having the manufacturer involved in guiding us as to what the real problem is the best course of action, because we are of the view that there is a question mark being raised with respect to the ability to maintain the services and what is required to be in place to ensure that proper maintenance is in action.
And finally, could I ask the report that the Prime Minister says he received on the 11-year-old problem with these vessels of not having kept the records? Is this a report that you received in writing or orally?
I received no report in writing. I said in conversation with the management on Sunday afternoon.
Member for Carinese.
Honourable Prime Minister, in the government's decision to move forward in alleviating this problem, searching for new vessels to do the work, how far have you reached in that, and when can the people expect some alleviation of their difficulties?
I would ask the member to pay attention to the statements by the minister responsible for this activity, which is the Minister of Transport, who has indicated on more than one occasion that the actions of the ministry and the port working together to bring some relief to the Tobagoans in particular in the shortest order is that we expect that an interim arrangement with a different vessel would be in place for the ferry service by the end of this month.
Member for Carinese.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Could the Honourable Prime Minister indicate whether the probe, as promised by the Attorney General, into allegations of mismanagement, corruption and bid rigging into the Educational Facilities Company Limited has been completed? If so, when would its findings be made available to the Parliament?
Madam Speaker, When we came into government in September 2015, one of the first difficulties we encountered was the whole rush of allegations and claims and actions of misconduct at this particular company, as a result of which I, as Prime Minister, had to ask the Attorney General to look at what was going on in EFCL as we appointed a board. After a year of this board wrangling with those problems, we have had to appoint a new board, elements of a new board. And at the moment, the Central Audit Committee is from the Ministry of Finance. Corporation Seoul is conducting an investigation into the total operations of this company. And when that is concluded, I'll be in a better position to respond to the concerns of the honourable member.
Member for Carneys.
Is there any particular reason why, as Prime Minister, who has the responsibility overall, have decided to keep 2 or 3 of the former board directors? What's the reason?
Yes, there was very good reason, Madam Speaker, because we had, in seeking to grapple with the issues surrounding this company, we had appointed some new members to the board in February. And with the chairman resigning in May or June, we were then required to reconstruct the board. And because these 3 persons had only just gone on there and would have been not exposed to anything before, we felt it was necessary to, or it was okay to keep them because they had only just joined the board in February.
Member for Chaguanas West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable Prime Minister, is there a foreign forensic team assisting the central audit in the investigation on this matter?
Not at this time, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Prime Minister, in the context of you said the findings will be made available. And if there are no findings now, how is it that you made the decision to terminate 3 directors and leave 3?
Madam Speaker, I'm not aware that we've terminated directors. We had some resignations and the board had to be reconstituted. So we've left the 3 new members who had not resigned, who had just been appointed. And where we had vacancies created by resignation, we have strengthened the board, and in fact, we are in the process of completing the appointments to that board.
Member for Carney East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Could the Prime Minister state what measures he intends to implement to address the problems being experienced by patients in the healthcare system? It's a broad thing, but I can ask you supplementals on it.
Madam Speaker, all healthcare systems across the world are continuously plagued by problems. Trinidad and Tobago is no different. We acknowledge that there are a series of problems, and those problems could be related to infrastructure, to financing of the operations, supply of medicine, supply of caregivers, and so on. So we acknowledge that these are ongoing situations, and there's no day in which these problems would have been solved. So very early in the tenure of this government, and in recognition that there's a need to continuously try to do better as a government with respect to healthcare delivery, one of the things we did was to appoint a committee of experts, if you may call it that. I'll just say experienced people. And this committee was required as its mandate to look at the whole question of healthcare delivery in Trinidad and Tobago. That committee was chaired by a very experienced doctor, Dr. Winston Welsh, and he was ably supported by Dr. Wayne Frederick, a national who is the president of Howard University and a medical practitioner. Professor Carl Theodore, who, as you know, out of UWI is an expert in healthcare economics. Mr. Martin DeGans, Dr. Adesh Serju Singh, Mrs. Valerie Allen Rawlins, and Dr. Albert Prasad. This team was assigned the responsibility of looking at the healthcare system in Trinidad and Tobago with a view to identifying its problems and making recommendations to solving these problems as identified. As you would have been aware, Madam Speaker, this committee submitted its report a few months ago. The report came to there are two separate reports, yes. There was the first one and the second one, which both together now form the basis for a series of consultations which are currently underway, led by the Ministry of Health, and the report itself has been laid in the Parliament and is before a select committee of the House.
Member for Carneys.
Bearing in mind that the work that has to go on further in the deliberations of the recommendations of this committee, Honorable Prime Minister, would you acknowledge that this will take some time to go still to begin to implement some of the recommendations when it has to go through the JSA and so on? But what urgent measures are you going to take to alleviate the situations of chronic drug shortage, no instrument and equipment for surgical operations, the delay in surgical operation time, etc.? It needs urgent attention. Could you give us some elucidation on this?
The Ministry of Health, under the guidance of the Minister of Health, are addressing those issues on a daily and ongoing basis.
Member for Oropouche West.
Madam Speaker, to the Honourable Prime Minister, in relation to the recent transfer of the Permanent Secretary and Communications Officer of the Ministry of Sport and Youth Affairs, could the Prime Minister indicate if any further action will be taken in this ministry to curtail mismanagement of public funds?
The government's interest in the curtailment of mismanagement with respect to public funds is an ongoing exercise, and it doesn't only apply to the Ministry of Sport. And insofar as there's a need to have any further action taken, as soon as those decisions are made, he will be advised publicly.
Member for Couva South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Honourable Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister, satisfied with the explanations given by the Minister of Sport and Youth Affairs for the expenditure incurred at taxpayers' expense on his recent trip to Tobago?
Madam Speaker, this Prime Minister has very high standards and it's very difficult to be satisfied. So it might very well be that, given the high standards I maintain and expect, that this is not the only matter that has not met my satisfaction.
Member for Princestown.
Madam Speaker, to the Honourable Prime Minister. Honourable Prime Minister, with respect to your comments about having a young cabinet and needing experience and assistance in terms of management, can you indicate whether there's any formal arrangements being put in place to provide management experience in members of your cabinet?
Madam Speaker, the question of the age of ministers or the experience of ministers is not an excuse for non-performance. However, having accepted portfolio responsibilities, there's a requirement, and that requirement is being met from time to time. We will review what is being done internally, and if external help is required, that help is brought in. But cabinet responsibility, as the member may never understand, you are always exposed to learning as you go forward in the dispensing of public service at cabinet responsibility level.
Member for Couva South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. In relation to this trip, could the Prime Minister advise this House how many stakeholders did the Minister of Sport meet with, the site visits he conducted in Tobago, and how many awards did he hand out at the Tobago House of Assembly Sports Award?
Member, I will not allow that as a matter falls under the purview of Prime Ministerial questions. Member for Couva South.
6, Madam Speaker, to the Prime Minister. Would the Prime Minister advise as to what reforms the government is considering for the national insurance system in light of recent pronouncements by the management of the National Insurance Board that its funds will be exhausted by 2030 under the current mode of operation?
Madam Speaker, with respect to this development and this particular matter, the government would be guided by the findings and recommendations of the 9th Actuarial Review of the National Insurance System and advice from expert consultants hired for that purpose.
Member for Curaçao.
Madam Speaker, is the Prime Minister in agreement with certain pronouncements in relation to this issue that if reform doesn't occur now, that the management of NIB will be forced to sell off assets of the national insurance system?
Madam Speaker, that is not a matter for me to be in agreement or disagreement with. That's a statement of fact. If the operations are to continue beyond any date of insolvency.
Member for Pointe-a-Pierre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Honourable Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister say whether the government has reached an agreement to divest 40% of Trinidad Generation Unlimited, TGU, to a private sector investor?
Madam Speaker, the Minister of Finance in his capacity as Corporation Sole is currently exploring the divestment of 40% of TGU, and there is no agreement at this time, but as was mentioned in the national budget, in order to raise capital for the development program, the Minister of Finance will take steps to divest this and other assets within the fiscal year 2017. And that work is proceeding apace, and we anticipate that it will be concluded in some time to allow some capital injection into the ongoing development program.
Member for Pointe-a-Pierre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Supplementary to the Prime Minister, could the Prime Minister be a bit more definite as far as the timeline for divestment of this 40%?
I thought I just did that. The timeline is within fiscal 2017. The fiscal year ends in September. And as was said in the budget, the divestment ought to take place within this year so that we could receive the money within this year to deal with the accounts of this year, fiscal year ending September 30th. And I think the Minister of Finance is working on that. If we get interested parties, proper arrangements, and we conclude the transactions, we're working towards being able to conclude those matters so that the funding of the transfer of the shares would allow the 40% worth of shares to come into the Minister of Finance's account, exchequer account, before the end of the fiscal year.
Member for Chaguanas West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable Prime Minister, what is the procurement process, keeping with the government commitment to transparency and value for money, in acquiring this divestment partner in divestment?
The process is the widest process. We are having indicated in the national budget a public expression that we are interested in receiving from interested parties, and we prepare to divest. We are considering offers. We are inviting persons who may be interested, international companies that are working in Trinidad and Tobago in the area. We're looking at the broader spectrum, and the Cabinet will determine, based on the offers, what is the best option for the government of Trinidad and Tobago.
For Tabakit.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Prime Minister, in selling off these assets, it's easy to have all these funds utilized perhaps for recurrent expenditure. Has the Prime Minister considered whether in divesting these assets, which are capital assets, that the funds so received are placed into a special capital development fund so that they'll be used to generate medium to long-term streams of income for new capital projects rather than simply dissipating it in current expenditure?
Madam Speaker, it's very interesting that these proposals are coming now. It would have been a whole lot more useful when NGC had $16 billion in their bank account. If we had said that monies drawn down from NGC would go into a diversification program or new development projects, it's a great idea. Except that those funds were spent within the confines of all kinds of things I don't know. But right now, given the fungibility of money, where if we spend money in the health sector on medicine, we don't have it to spend on the road building program. If we spend money on the school salaries for the teachers, we don't have it to spend on tourism infrastructure. However, what we are doing as per the national budget, we are running a deficit on the basis that we will borrow money and ensure that a capital program exists, which is funded, well, one can identify by the money we borrow. But to say that this dollar is spent on that and that dollar is spent on that, that's not how it goes. The ability to keep the capital program going in a deficit budget can be interpreted that we are borrowing to spend on the capital program.
Member for Chaguanas West. Member for Chaguanas West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, to the Honourable Prime Minister, I go back to the procurement process. Is this going to be where there's clear criteria, there's a valuation? What is being done in terms of the process so as to ensure we get the value for money for this significant part of our capital assets?
Yes, I want to give the member the assurance that a value done by arm's length valuators would be established for the asset of TGU, and therefore 40% of it can be easily calculated, and then whoever is partnering with the government would be required to pay at that valuation. And of course, if I go a little further, the Minister of Finance also indicated that the government would maintain majority shareholding in the company so as to be in control of its future in a certain way, and there would be a small, I think it's 10% or 9%? 9% of the shareholding of that company would be made available to the, in the form of a share IPO, where nationals, pension funds, unit trusts, and so on can have a shareholding. So it is the intention to sell down the asset to the point of 49%, while the state retains 51%, and that has been made clear by the Minister of Finance before. So I want to give the assurance that this is as transparent as it can get.
But for point of order.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Honourable Prime Minister, question 8. Would the Prime Minister inform this House as to the amount of dividends paid by the National Gas Company, NGC, to the Ministry of Finance for the period September 14, 2015 to April 30, 2017?
Madam Speaker, for the period 14th of the 9th, 15, that is 14th of September 2015, to 30th of April 2017, NGC advises that they've paid $3.3 billion in dividend. And that is not earnings. That includes the monies obtained by the sale of the TTNGL shares. So a significant portion of that came from the sale of those assets.
For point of order.
Madam Speaker, to the Prime Minister. Could the Prime Minister explain what these $3.3 billion was used for in the last 21 or 20 months?
Once again, Madam Speaker, I'm flabbergasted to receive a question like that from the other side. We received in the period of the last year $3.3 billion, of which the majority was for the sale of shares in TTNGL. Compare that, Madam Speaker, with $14 billion paid to the last government. And we cannot find what that $14 billion was spent on. He's coming to ask me now what we use $3.3 billion to do. We use it to close the deficit gap in the national budget.
Member for Couva North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Prime Minister, number 9, could the Prime Minister give an update on the Tobago Sandals project?
Madam Speaker, this project, the discussions between the government's team, because the government has put in place a special purpose vehicle, and qualified individuals to negotiate the entry of sandals into Trinidad and Tobago. Those discussions took place in April and continued into May, and we are expecting a visit from Sandals in the very near future. And it is my expectation that the discussions could be satisfactorily concluded in the not too distant future. And as soon as such conclusions are obtained, the national public would be advised. But the discussions continue as per an orderly fashion.
Honourable members, the time for Prime Minister's question is now spent.
Questions?
Member for Caroni East.
To the Minister of Works and Transport, could the Minister provide the reasons why the school bus and maxi taxi operators managed by the Public Transport Service Corporation have not been paid within the expected payment time?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this situation is unfortunate. It had to do with the movements of funds to PTSC. However, this situation is being rectified. Thank you.
Member for Caroni East.
No. What's the expected? No, the question asked, what is the expected date of payment of this? If the Minister could render a little guess or some substance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I said, the situation is being rectified and payment should be by the end of next week. Thank you. Madam Speaker, I must add this payment is for May of 2017.
Member for Oropouche East.
Very much, Madam Speaker, to the Honourable Minister of Finance. In light of current media reports, could the Minister state whether it is the policy of state boards to provide security at taxpayers' expense for directors who claim to have received threats?
Finance.
Madam Speaker, the matter that has been reported in the Trinidad Guardian newspaper caused me to ask the chairman of the National Lotteries Control Board for an immediate report. And on my way to Parliament, I was advised that the report has been sent. I must say, I found the report to be a matter for concern. I can't comment until I receive the report from the chairman of the National Lotteries Control Board.
Member for Oropouche.
Thank you very much. Madam Speaker, I'll ask the Minister, notwithstanding your sincere response, is it the policy of state boards to provide security at taxpayers' expense for directors who claim to have received threats? That's a question.
I think it would be best for all of us to wait until I receive the report, and then I can deal with that specific question.
Member for Oropouche.
Could I ask the Minister if the report is expected to tell us whether it is the policy of state boards to provide security at taxpayers' expense for directors who have received threats? Will the report tell us that?
Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, I think I will wait until I receive the report.
Member for Couva South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Minister of National Security. Given the recent fatal shootings of mentally challenged persons by officers of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, could the Minister advise this House of the initiatives and programs that the Ministry is prepared to introduce as part of the training and retraining of police officers to deal with mentally challenged persons?
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Allow me to convey our heartfelt condolences and sympathies to the family of the deceased persons. Officers of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, Madam Speaker, are trained to treat with confrontation by all categories of persons, including mentally ill persons. The Police Service Academy Induction Training Program offers training to recruits with respect to treating with mentally ill persons. This is facilitated through the administration of the Behavioral Sciences course, which contains 17 modules. on a number of contemporary societal and ethical topics. Specifically, module number 15 covers dealing with mentally ill and special needs individuals. In addition, Madam Speaker, Standing Order number 33 of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service defines who is considered to be a mentally ill individual, as well as a person designated to treat with such individuals. It also provides guidelines for the handling of mentally ill persons who have breached the law and have been detained into police custody, and dictates a process to be adopted by police officers for such. Furthermore, the Standing Order states that when and how a police officer shall render assistance for the apprehension and safe conveyance of the mentally ill person to a psychiatric hospital, medical institution designated for handling such cases, or indeed to a police station. To augment this, a reference guide identifies quick tips on effective communication, de-escalation techniques, and general interaction when treated with mentally ill persons. The Trinidad and Tobago Police Service Force will continue to train officers. Madam Speaker, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service is in the process of reviewing its training program.
Speaking time is expired. Member for Barataria Samuel.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Is the minister aware of the amount of mentally ill patients who have died as a result of improper restraining methods by the police?
Member, I will allow that as a supplemental question. Member for Oropuch West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Minister of National Security. In light of a recent report that several investigations and prosecutions have been hampered due to the delay in the return of DNA results by foreign laboratories, could the Minister state what action is being taken to treat with this problem?
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The Ministry of National Security continues to persevere in delivering services within its remit in a timely manner. There is no indication from the relevant heads of security that such a problem exists.
Member for Oropuch West.
Honourable Minister, what does timely manner mean?
Just what?
Minister.
Just what it says, Madam Speaker.
Member for Caroni East.
Could the Minister indicate what time frame is expected for the international accreditation of the forensic lab, which conducts the DNA sampling, the international accreditation?
It's an ongoing process. I do not have the precise information requested by the honourable member.
Member for Oropuch West.
Madam Speaker, to the Minister of National Security, in light of the allegations made by the minority leader of the Tobago House of Assembly in relation to the discontinuation of patrols by the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard in Tobago, could the Minister indicate if these allegations are true, and if so, what are the reasons?
Minister of National Security.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The Trinidad and Tobago Defence Force can assure the public that the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard, along with the other arms of the Trinidad and Tobago Defence Force, continue to provide for the defence and security of Tobago by land, sea and air. While there is a matter that is being resolved with one of the fuel stations on the island, this has not affected the Trinidad and Tobago Defence Force's ability to ensure that the island remains properly secured. Thank you, Madam.
Member for Couva North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Minister of Works and Transport, could the Minister indicate to the House what is the time frame for the arrival of the replacement passenger vessel needed to urgently address the worsening problems on the sea bridge?
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the Port Authority is working on a replacement vessel and is currently finalizing the agreement. A time frame cannot be determined until all inspections and negotiations are completed. However, the Port Authority is working towards a June 30th, 2017 deadline.
Member for Barata-Arisano.
Honourable Minister, could you indicate will the port from Togo to Tobago be started?
Member, I would not allow that as a supplemental question. Member for Chaguanas West.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, could the Honourable Minister indicate what is the cost of the procurement of this vessel, if he is in the possession of the information and the name of that particular vessel that the Port Authority is securing?
Minister of Works and Transport.
Speaker, we are in the process of negotiations. However, unlike the previous vessel acquired by the port, the MV Superfast, no cost is associated with the procurement of this vessel.
Questions for oral answer.
Leader of the House.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we will be answering all of the oral questions, save question 135, and we are asking for a 2-week deferral for that question. With regard to the written questions, we'll be answering both questions. And Madam Speaker, may I ask that question number 136 be asked as the last question on the order paper, please. Thank you.
Member for Oropouche West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Is it question number 5 is one? Okay. Question number 135? To the Minister.
37.
Question number 137 to the Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Treatment resumed on Monday, 22nd May 2017.
Member for Naparima.
Forward. Question, thank you, Madam Speaker. Question number 141 to the Minister of National Security.
Minister of National Security.
May I? He's coming.
The reply to question is as follows. The Immigration Act, Chapter 1801, defines an immigrant as a person who seeks admission into Trinidad and Tobago for permanent residence or who is within Trinidad and Tobago as a permanent resident. As of May of this year, there were 30,200 persons who were granted permanent resident status by the Ministry of National Security. With respect to persons who are in the country illegally, this category includes persons who do not hold permanent resident status. The certificate issued to them would have expired and there are no records to indicate that they would have left the country. Based on the Ministry's records, for the period January the 1st to May the 1st of this year, there were 15,042 such persons. Of this total, 183 were of Chinese nationality, 326 of Colombia, 39 Nigerians, 65 Guyanese, 1,415 Venezuelans, 217 Dominicans, and 20 Jamaicans. Also, there are those who would have entered Trinidad and Tobago through illegal ports of entry and whose presence is detected through reports and exercises undertaken by the Ministry of National Security. Madam Speaker, information relating to the nationality of persons granted permanent resident status and details of the total number of persons in the country illegally as a result of the expiration of their landing certificate is not readily available and could not be compared within the time frame allotted to respond to this question. Thank you.
Member for Couva North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question number 142 to the Minister of Tourism.
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Tourism is an important economic sector for many Caribbean countries, which contributes effectively to the gross domestic product due to its role in national resource development, employment generation, and its social and cultural importance. Festivals are seen as a major source of income for tourism at local, regional, and international levels. Throughout the Caribbean, festival tourism is gaining prominence in the tourism calendar. With this premise, the Tobago Jazz Experience has been employed as an event marketing tool to create a unique tourism experience for visitors to Tobago. The festival initiative has been used to increase Tobago's visibility in the local, regional, and international market. The Tobago Jazz Experience is in its 9th year of celebration, with a reduced budget of $12 million in 2017. The Tobago Jazz Experience was able to stimulate economic activity on the island while showcasing Tobago to the world. Given the arrivals, both domestic and international, to the island, the following sectors benefited during the period: transport through rentals, taxis, tour buses, etc., restaurants. Several high-end restaurants and food outlets across the southwestern side of Tobago would have benefited significantly from business, accommodation in the hotels, guest houses, villas, self-catering apartments, and even people's private homes, retail, groceries, gas stations, shops, craft vendors, artists and other retail outlets, tours, reef boat operators, island tours, tour guides, sites and attractions, micro-adventure tours, birding, dive, and other niches, event suppliers, caterers, media, printing services, janitorial companies, sound system operators, stage suppliers, tower lighting, chairs and table suppliers, Tobago artists and bands. Several Tobago-based bands were used throughout the festival and for many events. Community and village groups. Many community-based groups benefited from operating food and craft booths at the event and skilled employment to execute the functioning, or should I say the operations, during the Jazz Experience, and this is according to the Tobago House of Assembly Division of Tourism and Culture.
Member for Couva North supplemental.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Minister, you didn't answer my question. I asked how much revenue was generated. I want you to quantify the amount of revenue that was generated from the Tobago Jazz Festival.
Madam Speaker, the figure is not immediately before me at this time, and I can provide this at a later date from the Tobago House of Assembly. It's not quantified at this matter.
Member for Tabakit.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Through you. Does the minister have in her possession the number of persons who arrived for the actual festival? And what was the hotel occupancy rate during that particular time?
I will not allow that as a supplemental question. Member for Couva North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question number 143 to the Minister of Tourism.
Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Tobago Jazz Experience is an event marketing tool that is designed to create a unique tourism experience for visitors. It has been celebrated for the past 9 years and is used as demand pulling during the off-peak season, the tourism calendar. The Tobago Jazz Experience is managed by the Division of Tourism, Culture and Transportation. Based on survey reports by the Research Unit of the Tobago House of Assembly's Division of Tourism, Culture and Transportation, visitor arrivals to the island during the Tobago Jazz Experience were mainly from the domestic market as outlined. Ferry arrivals were 7,727, and for Caribbean Airlines arrivals, 13,134 arrivals, giving a total of 20,867 arrivals. Now, Madam Speaker, I want to highlight that the figure for the ferry had decreased by about 40 to 50% for those who would have arrived by ferry, of course, due to the problems that we are facing. passenger arrivals to Tobago during the period, which is the 21st to the 30th. The domestic is 20,867. I want to expand on that later. The Division of Tourism, Culture and Transportation of the Tobago House of Assembly has advised that the direct international passenger arrivals to Tobago over the Jazz period was 680 persons. Now, I want to say, Madam Speaker, that this only takes into account the week of Jazz, or the period of Jazz, which is Jazz was the 22nd to the 29th. The period accounted for here is the 21st to the 30th. So it doesn't take into account people who would have come in for Easter and stayed on for the rest of Jazz, or those who would have come in Good Friday, Thursday, and the days prior. These figures were also based on the 10 direct flights that flew into Tobago only, and that is a challenge right now, Madam Speaker, because as of 2008, as I would have stated before, we're only able to capture flight arrivals that for people who flew directly into Tobago. So this does not account for people who would have landed in Trinidad and moved on to Tobago, and that is a problem that the Ministry of Tourism, the Tobago House of Assembly, and the CSO is now trying to work out. So whilst prior to 2008, when you look at arrival figures for Tobago, it would have included people who would have landed in Trinidad or spent some time in Trinidad and then on to Tobago. The figures after that only show for flights directly into Tobago, and that in itself is a challenge, Madam Speaker.
Member for Couva North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question number 144 to the Minister of Public Utilities.
Minister of Public Utilities.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, in its ongoing project of developing the sector, TSTT developed a 5-year strategic plan. The focus was on expanding the country's fiber access to 200,000 homes, rolling out the LTE high-speed wireless data network to key parts of the country, and a complete overhaul of its broadband network technology and introduction of a suite of first-world business operations support systems. The 5-year strategic plan was presented to the Cabinet and subsequently to the Minister of Finance. TSTT also sought the approval of the Minister of Finance to borrow a sum of $1.9 billion to finance this strategic plan. TSTT was issued with a letter of non-objection on October 14, 2016 by the Ministry of Finance, which granted approval to so do. Madam Speaker, TSTT's acquisition of Massey Communications Limited is firstly consistent with the procedures the company must follow for acquisitions, and secondly, aligned to its 5-year plan for engaging the telecommunications industry. This acquisition has afforded TSTT a strategic opportunity to not only improve its operational efficiency and service quality, but also to expand both its infrastructure and customer base. The acquisition of Massey Communications Limited was a well-thought-out plan, well thought out by the TSTT's management, and was the subject of a detailed due diligence exercise undertaken over a sustained period. This analysis included technical, financial, legal, and operational reviews of the industry experts and consultants. The Board of Directors, in its approval of the proposal to acquire Massey Communications Limited, are confident that it is a sound business decision that will benefit not only the company and its shareholders, but also its customer base and the public at large. The expected outcomes from TSTT's decision to acquire Massey Communications include identifiable benefits such as: 1. The acquisition of Massey Communications' new state-of-the-art 900-kilometer broadband fiber network, passing approximately 34,000 households and businesses, thereby reducing the need to spend approximately $20 million in foreign exchange capital expenditure for this. The ability of TSTT to speed up deployment of its fiber network by an additional 3,000 homes passed per month. Access to Massey Communication service delivery technology and processes that allows for delivery of service to customers within 2 days of order. Access to Massey Communications 6,000 residential customer base and upsell its portfolio voice and security services. Access Massey Communications sales team that have successfully commercialized in excess of 6,000 residential customers. Direct access to over 100,000 Massey loyalty card holders and provided them with incentives to purchase communications services from TSTT. Significant reduction in the acquisition of costs by increased economies of scale when combined with TSTT's existing entertainment customers. Reduction in TSTT's level of planned investment in automation by approximately $20 million and improvement in the efficiency and effectiveness of customer service. And finally, Madam Speaker, acquisition of Massey's Communications robust enterprise business and its entire business support systems. Madam Speaker, TSTT's acquisition of Massey Communications Limited has saved the company significant expenditure in making use of the infrastructure, technology, and systems that are already in place, especially so at a time when there are obvious challenges with maintaining our foreign exchange reserves. Madam Speaker, I thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Minister, did this rationale include a restructuring or cutting of the labor force of TSTT?
Public Utilities.
Nowhere in the program, as I have just outlined it, did that matter arise.
Member for Carney East.
You indicated that TSTT has got approval for 1.9 billion. Other than this 255 million spent so far on acquiring Massey Communications, are you aware of any other plans in any acquisition, mergers, etc., with the rest of the funding from the 255 to the 1.9 billion?
Minister,
thank you very much, my friend, for Carinese, but I am unable to speak to that matter at this time.
Member for Chaguanas West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Having regard to the fact that on another occasion you indicated that Massey Communications lost $2 million in 2015 and $40 million in 2016 in the context of the annual report. Is the $255 million purchase an appropriate price, or do you think that the price ought to have been significantly less, having regard to the fact that they were losing such significant sums of money?
The Speaker outlined the manner and the techniques applied in arriving at the decision for the acquisition of Massey Communications, and that was done after due diligence by the company.
Member for Baratari San Juan.
Is the minister now convinced after such a long time, 2 weeks, that it was a good deal?
Minister of Public Utilities.
I have always admired the benefits as they have been described by me a few moments ago, Madam Speaker.
Member for Orpuch West. We've gone back to question 136.
Question number 136 to the Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Madam Speaker, I thank the member for this question, which gives me an opportunity to provide an update on the settlement of outstanding benefits to former Caroni workers. Madam Speaker, the voluntary separation of employment plan for Caroni 1975 Limited became effective on August 2nd, 2003, just about 14 years ago, subsequent to a 2003 industrial court consent order executed between the All Trinidad General Workers Trade Union and Caroni 1975 Limited, the employer. Under that visa, the company committed itself to several benefits to the 7,865 daily paid workers who form part of that consent order. Another 1,155 monthly paid workers also availed themselves of a separate visa, making the total Caroni Limited commitment 9,020 workers. Since 2003, Madam Speaker, Caroni has been working to discharge commitments to the former workers. To date, Enhanced severance benefits in the amount of $742 million were paid immediately in August 2003. Training programs and retooling opportunities were provided to 2,520 former workers who applied for training and other support programs. This was delivered at a cost of $17 million. 1,430 pieces of rolling stock were sold to former workers or to cane farmers by auctions, direct sales, or offsetting arrangements. And finally, pension arrangements for 10,094 pension-eligible beneficiaries were placed on a sound and secure basis at a cost of $250 million. Madam Speaker, in relation to the remaining benefits, there were two other benefits offered under the 2003 VSEP program. The first was the offer of a residential lot to those workers who at the time had not owned a residential parcel of land. And the second was the offer of a 2-acre parcel of land to any worker who was interested and had applied at the time. In respect of those residential service lots, Madam Speaker, applications for residential service lots at the time in 2003 amounted to 7,514 applications. Of those 7,514 applicants, 4,101 leases, or 55%, have been executed, with another 279 awaiting execution. Of that amount, 3,960 leases, or 53%, have been collected, and a further 141 will be distributed shortly. Madam Speaker, 3,134 applications received before the deadline are yet to be satisfied. In respect of the agricultural leases, Madam Speaker, applications for the 2-acre size agricultural plots at the time of closure 2003 amounted to 7,246 applicants. Of those, 5,603 leases, or 77%, have been prepared, executed, and registered at the Office of the Registrar General. 127 beneficiaries received their leases and surrendered them for various reasons, and they were compensated. There remains, Madam Speaker, 1,516 beneficiaries who have not completed the application processes. In fact, Madam Speaker, so determined was the government to complete this exercise in relation to the 2-acre agricultural plots. In January 2017, we placed an advertisement in the newspaper with the names of all these former Caroni workers for whom we have leases already prepared, but they cannot be located. As I close, Madam Speaker, let me say that during the period December 2015 to February 2017, 14 months, this government has distributed more than 3,000 leases to former Caroni employees. Let me also say, Madam Speaker, based on the distribution.
Time has expired.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Member for Couva South Supplemental.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. To the Minister, is the Minister in a position to inform this House whether those persons who, or ex-workers who would have paid the 20,000 to 30,000 deposit to the Sugar Industry Labour Welfare Committee, have they been refunded their outstanding money?
Minister of Agriculture.
Madam Speaker, those former workers who paid the monies to the Sugar Industry Labour Welfare Committee, the government is currently considering a request from the Minister of Housing and Urban Development to reconstitute the board of the Sugar Industry Labour Welfare Committee. And once a new board in place, those workers would be refunded their monies.
Member for Princess Town.
Madam Speaker, Honourable Minister, in light of what you've just indicated, my constituency has a number of persons that are affected with this particular issue. Can you seek to give us some sort of timeline in terms of the reconstituting of this board and then the thereafter?
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Madam, unfortunately, I would not bind the cabinet. I can't do that. But I could say that the government is aware of the issue, and once a board is appointed, the monies will be refunded.
Central.
Minister, through you, Madam Speaker, you said that you had advertised the names of workers who could not be located. How will you manage this to make sure that the benefits are in fact facilitated?
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Well, let me say that since the advertisement in January, about 400 have come forward. And then we would continue to work with that list to ensure. Some people may have migrated, they may have people who have died. So we'll continue to work through this is in relation to the 2-acre agriculture plot to ensure that the beneficiaries receive the leases.
Requests for leave to move the adjournment of the House on definite matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers.
Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, on May 31st, 2017, I indicated that 2 of the 14 private special schools registered with the Ministry of Education had received checks for the 2016-2017 academic year. On Friday, June 2nd, there were newspaper reports that none of the schools was paid. I was out of the country on official government business, but I immediately called for a report on the matter. Madam Speaker, it is with great regret and humility that I advise today that, though no fault of my own, my original statement was incorrect. It was never my intention to mislead or misrepresent the facts, and today I rise to provide some clarity on the matter. After an exhaustive investigation, it has been ascertained that the payment vouchers had in fact been prepared and verified. However, the Comptroller of Accounts had previously issued instructions to all ministries that salary payments were to be given priority. The officer who had provided me with the information that the 2 schools had been paid had overlooked this restriction and assumed that the checks had been printed and issued. In his haste to respond to my inquiry, the officer failed to double-check this information. My Permanent Secretary and I personally interviewed the officer, and I am persuaded that the misinformation was a genuine error and was not a display of negligence or dereliction of duty. He has been cautioned to thoroughly verify all relevant particulars in future and has been made aware of the serious consequences that could befall any officer who is less than careful with the information given to a minister or member of parliament. Thank you.
Personal explanations, introduction of bills, motions relating to the business or sittings of the House and moved by a minister, public business, government business, bills, second reading.
Honourable members, the debate on the second reading of the following bill, which was in progress when the House adjourned on Friday, June 2nd, 2017, will be resumed. A bill entitled, An Act to Amend the Marriage Act, Chapter 4501, the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, Chapter 4502, the Hindu Marriage Act, Chapter 4503, the Orisha Marriage Act, Chapter 4504, and the Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act, Chapter 4551. The members who have already contributed to this debate as follows. Honorable Faris Alwari, MP, the mover of the bill. Mr. Barry Padarath, MP. Honorable Ayana Webster Roy, MP. Mr. Rushan Parry, MP. Honorable Terence Dial Singh, MP. Dr. Fuad Khan, MP. Honorable Maxi Kafi, MP. Dr. Bohendradas Tuari, MP. Honorable Fitzgerald Hines, MP. Mr. Prakash Ramada, MP. Mr. Esmond Ford, MP. Ms. Ramona Ramdial, MP. Honorable Shamfa Kajru, MP. Dr. Suruj Ratan Rambachan, MP. Honorable Stuart Young, MP. Member for Chaguanas West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this debate on this bill has been going on for quite some time, since March 3rd and January 16th in the other place. In fact, today is June 9th, and one of my colleagues told me this debate is going on much longer than some marriages. Madam Speaker, with respect to the pieces of legislation, an act to amend the Marriage Act 4501, the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act Chapter 4502, the Hindu Marriage Act Chapter 4503, the Orisha Marriage Act Chapter 4504, and the Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act Chapter 4551. Madam Speaker, at this stage I seek your permission under Standing Order 4410 to read excerpts from a study later on in my presentation and contribution. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, first let me indicate that in principle I support the contents of this bill as a standardized and harmonized 18-year-old minimum age for the consent for marriage. The matter has been well aired in this House and from the national community and international levels. Many have weighed in on the pros and cons of this as a minimum age in order to achieve gender parity and gender equality in all spheres of national life. Madam Speaker, when I listen to the contribution of members on this side, in particular that of the member for Caroni Central and the member for Tabaquite, I say, well, we should just declare and get on with going into the committee stage of this act. And when I looked at the contribution of the honorable member for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West, I realized that he was merely singing the same hymn book about 12 and 13-year-old marriages and the recognition that there was no statistical data to support that. Madam Speaker, in supporting this principle of 18 years old as the capacity for marriage, it is not an equivocation. All of us on this side of the opposition support that. It is a commitment on our part. In fact, for us, it is a no-brainer. It is, we believe, in supporting this principle that we are on the right side of history. However, Madam Speaker, it is in the general handling and approach to airing of the issues surrounding this bill that I want to turn our attention of how this may be seen as an example of how a legislative agenda is set from the top can widen and deepen the rifts and amongst diverse groups in this society when legislation can set the tone for building and bridging divides in a diverse society. And Madam Speaker, I will demonstrate that the United Nations have recommended that this age of adjustment so as to bring social divides, to bridge social divides, and not to feed base instincts that pose a threat to our social fabric as it has been doing. Madam Speaker, further on, I will make some recommendations and proposals in relation to areas of the bill that I seem to think is lacking. Madam Speaker, in looking at this bill, It is clear that having regard, if one were to look at the nuances and the tone of the debate in the national community, that this bill has certain undercurrents. The bill now touches on more fundamental challenges of transforming our society and addressing the culture of our politics, the culture of lawmaking, cultural attitudes to law and order, the culture of violence and abuse, and how that is perpetuated in a society that is leaning towards extremism in so many ways, and the culture of how we treat with our diversity and multiculturalism. Madam Speaker, it is clear that the manner in which this legislation has been piloted in the context as mentioned by my colleague, the Honourable Member for Caroni Central, went through legislative tactics. The Honourable Attorney General removed the constitutional majority. By doing so, he engaged in a process that changed the substantive nature of the debate and, in a sense, the law. And I am of the view, Madam Speaker, that this issue of process has bedeviled this administration, the government. And when you look at FATCA, they had to come kicking and screaming into the Joint Select process, Joint Select Committee process. When we look at the whole question of the health sector report, they sought to engage the opposition in a Joint Select Committee. When you look at the 2030 vision, they sought to making it government policy first, but then they sought to bring it before a Joint Select Committee. But this, Honourable Attorney General, in the context of process and by legislative tactics, seeking to take a tactical advantage, sought to do away and impact negatively upon the substantive law. And that gave rise to suspicions in the national community, Madam Speaker. And, giving rise to suspicions in the national community, having regard to the fact that we have a history rooted in colonialism, slavery, indentureships, as we seek to define a path towards self-determination and nationalism. That is not the way to proceed. Madam Speaker, this bill before us is about respect for each other. It is about how we truly forge and craft laws and mechanisms and institutions that hold true to our national anthem. Every creed and race finds an equal place. Madam Speaker, when we say we want to address violence and abuse of children, when we say we want to address equality of women, but whilst all the amendments proposed in this bill before us may be speaking to all those issues, would it at the end of the day address these concerns in relation to the specific dilemmas that face our society? Madam Speaker, it is clear to us that when we pass this law, we will be meeting our obligation as a member of the international community, which adheres to a universal Declaration of Human Rights. Having signed the UN Convention that this bill speaks to, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and then the question arises, Madam Speaker, is it a law relevant to our communities and our society, that our society do not feel shortchanged by our actions as lawmakers? Is there a way that we can do that? This is not a simple issue at all, having regard to the emergence of these pieces of legislation we are seeking to amend. Madam Speaker, I want to draw your attention to an independent study, a very recent independent study on this issue, and on this raging debate on child marriages and gender equality and the cultural underpinnings in Trinidad and Tobago. The title is quite a mouthful, Madam Speaker. It is called Global Misogyny, Androgyny, Carnivology, Cultural Diversity, Religion, Sexuality and Human Rights in Sustainable Development of a Small Island State, Enacting Legislation and Action Against Early Marriages for Gender Equality in Trinidad and Tobago by Dr. Krishnade Rampasad, 2017. Madam Speaker, The aim of this study is to, and I quote, to analyze how the noble international efforts to achieve gender equality and eliminate violence and discrimination against society's most vulnerable can become at the national level such a messy entanglement that seems to be forcing divisions between ethnicities, religions, and cultures in Trinidad and Tobago, and where efforts to enact a recommendation of UN agencies seems to be effectively promoting social strife. Madam Speaker, this is an outcome that is very much against the intentions of those who support the notions of protection of the rights of women and children and all those who seek to nurture a culture of peace, end of quote. Madam Speaker, in this study, Dr. Rampersad notes that there are 50 shades of gray in dealing with this context of child marriages in Trinidad and Tobago, which he prefers to call early marriages, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, it is clear in my own mind, having regard to the law before us, that it requires a 3/5 majority. And when the Honorable Attorney General withdrew that, he ought to have accounted to the Parliament and to the people, having regard to the historical antecedents of the manner in which the Hindu marriage ordinance, the Muslim marriage ordinance, and the Orisha marriage ordinance came into being. Madam Speaker, so clearly I would indicate that it requires a 3/5 majority. If this piece of legislation is to move forward, it must have the stamp of the local realities, as we are a self-determining country shaping the international mandate to suit our local realities. Madam Speaker, we must recognize that we are living in a fragile, diverse society, and we ought to strengthen and not weaken the social fabric. We must establish within the bill mechanisms that show that we appreciate our diversity. We must address homegrown realities and the need for sensitive, community-based adjudication. Madam Speaker, we must provide the opportunity for exceptional circumstances, as advocated by not just the Hindu and Muslim groups, but by 18 civil society groups and the network of NGOs to restore basic quality of respect and value. For example, like the panchayat system, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this study identifies that the bill will now create 2 new categories of criminality and classes of criminalization: the criminalizing of minors and the criminalizing of religious officers. We need to ask ourselves, Madam Speaker, where will the law find room in the already overcrowded jails to deal with young people who, out of lust or love, want to engage in marriage, and the facilitative approach of the marriage officers, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this bill will also create a new category of illegitimate birth, where children are born to minors. Madam Speaker, in taking the historical context, where cultures were marginalized and deemed illegitimate, we are now returning to an archaic system, but not improving the law. What would happen to children born of unions under the age of 18? Would they live with illegitimacy, the stigma, the access to various provisions under law all their lives? Madam Speaker, I recall looking at my father's birth certificate because his parents married under bamboo. And so when they have Ratan Singh, illegitimate. And that is something that went on for generations until the 1945 passing and the 1960s and the 1980s passing of the various pieces of legislation. Madam Speaker, where is the place of the common law unions in this piece of legislation? Are we saying now that they cannot be married? And all of us have examples of children under 18 who want to get married for love or for other reasons. Are we then encouraging them to shack up? Madam Speaker, I will show that this law, for all these reasons, interferes significantly with fundamental elements of the Constitution's guarantee of human and cultural rights, and cannot therefore be passed as a backdoor piece of legislation. It requires no less than 3/5 majority. Madam Speaker, we have to keep in mind that these pieces of legislation, saved as they were part of the foundational period of our society to heal divisions and rifts between groups, and the manner in which it is being done today by the Honorable Attorney General is to erode that legacy. Madam Speaker, the Honorable Attorney General spoke about how his grandfather changed his name to Lionel Frank Sukaran from Lakshmidat Dar, Sharma Dar. People change their names in order to avoid the stigma associated with those names at that time, and also for social mobility. Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, and that therefore, we must therefore look at that in the context of our multi-religious, multicultural, secular society. So instead of advancing the law in this manner, we are eroding history, Madam Speaker, and eroding our legacy of trying to forge a nation out of diverse elements. Madam Speaker, I think I want to direct this to the Honorable Attorney General, through you, Madam Speaker. I'm sure he will be familiar with the Indian Centenary Review, reprinted by a group of persons supported by his mother, Diane Sukaran. And Diane Sukaran, as she saw this Indian Centenary Review as one of the legacies of her father, the AG's grandfather. And she dedicated that to his parents, Lionel Frank and Ruth Kamala Sukaran, and to my dearest children, Faris, Anil, and Asama, and so on, Madam Speaker. So you have that, and in that book it contains that history of the emergence of the Hindu ordinance and the importance of that, Madam Speaker. So that therefore we have to find a way in which we deal in this secular society with the recognition, the historical recognition of these facts, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, there has emerged in this debate over this bill an institution founded in the 1970s, the Interreligious Organization. There has been an unseeming battle that has emerged in this country, Madam Speaker, between elements of the IRO. Madam Speaker, in Act number 33 of 1973, and I read from the title of the act, an act to provide for the incorporation of the Interreligious Organization of Trinidad and Tobago, September 1973. And one of the aims and objects, Madam Speaker, is that the aims and objects of the IRO, A, to foster the collaboration of all religious organizations with a view of bringing about the spiritual, intellectual, and economic advancement of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. What has happened in the debate over this bill, Madam Speaker? What has happened is that the IRO, which to my mind a coming together of all the religious leaders, had the highest moral voice in this country. The IRO intervened, Madam Speaker, in the early 1970s to bring back Dr. Eric Williams to retain the prime ministership when he was contemplating resignation. The IRO in the mid-2000s brought Mr. Pandey out of jail when he was voluntarily in jail. But arising out of this debate, Madam Speaker, and I will just make quick reference to this, just to the newspaper headline. Go to hell, Mr. Archbishop, says Sat. Faith bodies blast IRO boss's child marriage claim. Sat tells RC Bishop, U.S. Ambassador, mind your business on child marriage. Madam Speaker, so you look at how, if you approach legislation insensitively, if you do not engage in the process in a manner that embraces all the elements with a blind eye to historical antecedents, you're going to have an unraveling of established institutions in your society, Madam Speaker. Because the IRO was founded back in the 1970s, and I want to make reference to that, Madam Speaker, because a lot of persons don't know that. Founded by the President of the Senate, the late Dr. Wahid Ali, Roman Catholic Archbishop Reverend Anthony Pantin, Pandit Lakshmidatta Shiva Prasad, and Anglican Bishop Clive Abdullah, who were nationalists, nation builders, and trying to carve a place for religious autonomy in Trinidad and Tobago, and founded the IRO on the principles that the state should not interfere in religion. Madam Speaker, it is the Bishop Abdullah is quoted as saying, it was agreed that all decisions had to be made by unanimous vote, and that we would avoid, like the plague, any form of political interference. The basis for membership of all religious bodies would be belief in the fatherhood of God and the universal brotherhood of man. Clearly, Madam Speaker, by what has happened, the manner in which the AG proceeded, the Honorable Attorney General proceeded, has brought about a subversion within the ranks of the IRO. Madam Speaker, so that what you have is that the manner in which process was established for this piece of legislation, and we all indicate on this side that we are committed to the age of majority of 18. We are all committed to that as the age of capacity for marriage. We all committed to that, and there is no question about that. But what we are saying, look, you can achieve your objective if, in the substantive law, if you provide with guide the process in a certain way. Madam Speaker, I, like many other members of the House, have been grasping to make sense of the disparate data and context presented by members opposite in trying to elicit support for the bill. A smattering of statistics couched in general international data about girls being forced into marriage by some religious denominations so they wouldn't be a burden to parents and for dowry, and girls not being given a chance to get an education and for self-development. Is this the Trinidad and Tobago we know, Madam Speaker? Madam Speaker, I summarize now some of the findings of the study by Dr. Rampersad, drawn from the collated national studies and statistics, the ILO, UN Women, ECLAC, UNDP, World Bank, and elsewhere. Madam Speaker, 1, we know that the average age of marriage in Trinidad and Tobago is age 29 for women and 31 for men. Not 12, 14, and 16 as we are being led to believe in this debate. Secondly, we know of changing attitudes and social practice where marriage as an institution is declining in importance in favor of other cohabitational arrangements, such as living in, visiting relationships, random cohabitation, and same-sex marriages, which the law does not address at all, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, when will the law address this issue of gay and lesbian rights in our country? When will it address that? Madam Speaker, when will legislation address that? I know that the Attorney General says that he is in support, but sympathy is insufficient. There has to be a practical dimension so that's to allow the gay and lesbian community to assert their rights in this country, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the study also points out that there are nearly 3 times as many persons under 19 are in common law or visiting or more fluid relationship than in marriage. 3 times. Fourthly, Madam Speaker, we know that more 14-year-olds are in a living or visiting rather than married relationships. 14-year-olds. are in a living or visiting rather than married relationships. That is derived from Census TT in 2011. What is going to happen to these 14-year-olds who are living in relationships, Madam Speaker? Are they going to be thrown in jail or their offsprings deemed illegitimate? How is this law going to address that situation? Or what law is going to address that situation in the context of this bill? Madam Speaker, we also know that there are increasing numbers of single household and single parent households. We know of changing patterns of family structure that show decline in the numbers of extended families, which used to be the support frame for early marriages. For early marriages, Madam Speaker. It provided, the extended family provided that safety net. Now, according to the CSO, the average household is now between 3 to 4 persons. So there isn't that kind of extended framework. So having regard to these statistics, Madam Speaker, we now recognize that supporting evidence from Caribbean studies point that show of women's empowerment show high levels of female independence in Trinidad and Tobago, with a higher than normal average of female-headed households, which is more than 33%. There are 3 times more females under 19 as heads of households than males. Madam Speaker, from data gathered in the study, Madam Speaker, family life experts estimate some 15% of all live births are from adolescent parents in Trinidad and Tobago, with the average age of sexual intercourse at 14, and some 3,000 pregnancies in schools per year. How is the law addressing this? At the last census in 2011, more than 40,000 children were born to persons under age 19. And some were born to persons under 14 years old, a high indicator of teenage pregnancies. And as I indicated before, Madam Speaker, 3 times more girls under 19 are head of households than boys. Madam Speaker, these statistics demonstrate that only a fraction of those were in the context of marriage and related to such social scourges as incest, rape, and generally early cohabitation as a socio-cultural norm. Perhaps when my friend, good friend, the Honourable Member for Tobago East can tell us what is the Tobago situation, because my statistics say it's pretty high. There's more, Madam Speaker. Much different from the norms in other societies, we know that girls in Trinidad and Tobago across age, race and ethnicity, location, class or income status have virtually equal access to educational opportunities as boys, 97%, and have been excelling through to tertiary levels, outnumbering and outperforming boys at tertiary levels. Madam Speaker, the gender parity in education is more than 1.5 in favor of girls to boys, which ranks Trinidad and Tobago higher than perceived high-ranking countries on the Gender Equality Index. Higher than France, higher than Belgium, higher than Finland, higher than Spain, Austria, Portugal, Netherlands, Chile, Switzerland, Japan, and Germany. Madam Speaker, these are important in this year as to what is happening with our girls, and this is really makes this piece of legislation virtually obsolete. Madam Speaker, we also know from the study that Trinidad and Tobago has less females out of school than developed countries as Switzerland, Norway, Canada, Spain, Sweden, Belgium, Finland, Denmark, the United Kingdom, France, Austria, the Netherlands, Germany, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and the United States. Madam Speaker, so there are more young children, girls in particular, utilizing the education system. So this talk about 12 and 14 getting married is really obsolete and irrelevant. Madam Speaker, when the member, I'm hearing the utterance of the member for Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West. He had no statistics in his contribution. I read it. And when the member for Tabakit spoke, he spoke about his mother. In the 1940s, Madam Speaker. So I want to just tell the member, next time you talk, better come with your facts. Madam Speaker? So all this point to the virtually obsolete practice of the marriage of girls 12, 14, and 16-year-old. That there is little evidence that such marriages are currently occurring, as the argument or question of forced marriage, as the argument for the legislation indicates. Where is the evidence of how many of these marriages are forced, Mr. Honorable Attorney General? Madam Speaker, it is clear to us that Trinidad and Tobago is well poised on the path for best practices as regards the treatment of a girl, child, and gender equity. And I quote,
Honorable Member for Chaguanas West, the original 30 minutes have expired. You're entitled to 15 more minutes if you intend to avail yourself of it. Please proceed.
Speaker, I intend to. Madam Speaker, I quote from the study. We know that the national picture is largely that. With higher levels of education, girls are delaying marriage because of and also because of the advice of parents, religious leaders, and elders. There is a decline in persons choosing early marriage or to be in a married relationship as opposed to higher numbers in single, fluid, or visiting relationships, as the statistics show. We know that in many instances, religious leaders are called on to advise young men and young women against early marriage to pursue their education and studies by parents and teachers. We know that many adolescent distractions, religious institutions cannot even hold on to their flock, Madam Speaker, and many of the established churches, there's a significant decline in their flocks. Madam Speaker, it is clear that what is in the law books is obsolete, and that therefore why we prioritize this piece of legislation, I don't know. Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, it is clear that we have to look at the whole question of the significant increase in teenage pregnancies, and we have to look at the particular health risks of young mothers and offsprings in Trinidad and Tobago, which is particularly inhibiting their life or life chances. And we have to look at the whole question of domestic violence and other correlated matters, rather than early childhood marriage, Madam Speaker, because that is really. We also have to look at the whole impact of Carnival, and the whole impact of Carnival, not in the economic sense, but in the social sense, and the whole question of how that impacts upon sexuality practice. We have to look at the whole question of the availability of abortion legislatively, and the whole question of sex education in schools, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, to my mind, there has been no real justification for the priority and urgency given to this bill as against the need for gender policy that gives holistic context to all its reform. There is no data presented that directly correlates local maternal mortality rates in relation to the statistics cited for child marriages. But maternal health is a concern, and we should take measures to redress that. That there is no data to support how many of the marriages cited were forced as opposed to other circumstances. There is no data to suggest what number of these marriages have been in the context of rape. There is no data to suggest how many of the statistics cited relate to efforts by parents, guardians, or religious leaders to protect youths by rallying around an early relationship or pregnancy to legitimize the infant and help the young couple through to maturity. And there is no evidence to say how many of the marriages were with much older partners to justify the claim of a culture of dirty old men. There's no evidence of how many marriages were from headstrong young women and men who decide on their own marriage as their choice, defying parents, religious and other community leaders. Madam Speaker, it is clear that this law, to amend this, is amending a really obsolete and irrelevant piece of legislation. And that therefore, you do so in the context that these pieces of legislation, as a priority, I don't understand the necessity for it because of the 100 recommendations made by the UN body. The Attorney General seeks to deal with one at the only age issue. Madam Speaker, it is clear to me that when you look at the historical evolution of these laws, the public law and the public policy process which the Attorney General engaged in this piece of legislation has moved from gender blindness to cultural deafness. There's been a deafness in the national community to those.
For the member for Chaguanas West. Any member who is not interested could take a little walk and return. Please continue, Chaguanas West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There has been a deafness in the national community, those who speak and continue to speak, understanding the struggle of people whose cultural heritage is rooted in slavery, oppression, colonialism, and threats to identity, when basic human rights, rights to religious practice, including marriage and other rights, were outlawed until very recently. Madam Speaker, and now again, it seems as if the Hindu, the Muslim, and the Orisha are singled out. These were the historically marginal peoples, Madam Speaker. There seems to be the emergence of a colonial historical alliance again in this society. But this bill also, Madam Speaker, is about who is respected and who is disrespected, and how the state itself perpetuates that culture of disrespect, Madam Speaker. In Trinidad and Tobago, Madam Speaker, we have to ensure that as we make laws, we do so with a view to ensuring the cohesion of our society. And it is clear that in the current situation, Madam Speaker, that this bill is unnecessary. It is unnecessary. So that therefore, the whole practice has demonstrated. So that therefore, what you have, Madam Speaker, so we're calling for a culture-sensitive approach. And that is what the Muslim Women's Organization, the Hindu Women's Organization, the 18 groups and the network of NGOs is saying. Let us create exceptional circumstances. Madam Speaker, in the time, I want to deal with the whole question of who is going to now determine whether or not, when these people shack up, when they live in illegitimate relationships, and the children, are they going to be illegitimate children? We have seen that so this piece of legislation will effectively expand that group, because we look at the statistics, and the statistics indicate that. So, Madam Speaker, I wish to now make certain recommendations in the time. One, we should strengthen marriage as an institution for social cohesion. We should strengthen marriage. We should level the playing field to acknowledge respect for religious and cultural diversity. We should reduce the sensitization of sexual behavior. We should refocus on those entrenched, ingrained, internalized, and coercive behaviors across all the society. This carnival mentality that has now seeped into our schools, giving rise to the levels of pregnancies that we see. We must reverse the perception of law and policy makers as public enemy number one. We must restore respect for family, religious organizations, as the prime denominator for social stability. We must shape the international mandate into a national image, into our national image, Madam Speaker, to take cognizance of the multiculturalism and the diversity of our society. We must give consideration to exceptional circumstances. It is, you say we are committed to 18 years as the age of majority, but there are certain exceptional circumstances that may arise. Pointed out, the need for judicial link, the need for parental consent, the need for the consent, the age restriction requirement between the parties, all those are very important considerations made by the NGOs. We must marry tradition with change, Madam Speaker. Create a mechanism in the bill to return to community-level adjudication, like the panchayat, and related African and Chinese culture-style micro-level decision-making machinery, so as to address localized issues such as the cohabitation, marriage. It used to happen before, Madam Speaker, before the society grew and evolved in a certain direction. So that, Madam Speaker, it is my view that this panchayat or culture and gender-sensitive tribunal will include members of the family, church, school, village council, etc. And it will bring back and restore dignity and reinforce the value of community, family, and religion, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, it is clear that this debate appears to have stirred up all festering animosities in our society. So that therefore we must reconsider our role as lawmakers. We must look at the process, and we must ensure that we embrace that consultative process. So this debate, Madam Speaker, is not so much about the lifting of the marriage age, but rejection of the notion of the interference by the state, which has traditionally been seen as an enemy, having regard to the historical evolution of these pieces of legislation. And we have done nothing in piloting this piece of legislation to change that mistrust. Madam Speaker, ours in this Parliament, as we in our 54th, or soon our 55th year of independence, is to demote force and promote choice in our society. We must guard against the law and us as lawmakers becoming a force of coercion rather than consensus. Madam Speaker, I want to end by quoting Khalil Gibran on children, Madam Speaker. It is something that my wife introduced to me about 3 decades ago when she was my girlfriend. And this is, Madam Speaker, and this is on a personal note, and I have kept it as a guide in parenting. Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life, longing for itself. They come through you, but not from you. And though they are with you, yet they belong not to you. You may give them your love, but not your thoughts, for they have their own thoughts. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You may strive to be like them, but seek not to make them like you, for life goes not backward, nor tarries with yesterday. You are the bows from which your children, as living arrows, are sent forth. The archer sees the path of the infinite, and he bends you with his might, that his arrows may go swift and far. Let your bending in the archer's hand be for gladness. For even as he loves the arrow that flies, so he loves also the bow that is stable. Madam Speaker, Khalil, I commend that, and I think that it's time that we begin to renew and have a new beginning so that we create the beachheads for the growth of our society as the 55th year of independence come about. And that we must be much more sensitive to the religious diversity and the multiculturalism of this society when we make legislation. I thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for St. Anne's East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to rise at this time in this House to contribute to this most important debate on this issue. Madam Speaker, since March the 3rd, 2017, we as the Parliament, the lower house, have been discussing this issue of the bill to deal with ending child marriage. And Madam Speaker, to be honest, I did not expect to be able to contribute to this bill because I thought that if nothing else, we would have finished this debate very, very quickly. It is to my surprise that we are now in June and still continuing this debate. To the extent, Madam Speaker, that I met a friend maybe laid down in March, and she's a Trinidadian living abroad. And she said to me, how are you all still discussing ending child marriage? She was honestly confused because she couldn't understand how something that was, according to the member for Chaguanas West, a no-brainer, could still be having debate in such a heated way as though the issues were not clear enough to be understood and dealt with expeditiously. Madam Speaker, I've been listening and we've had 15 members, and including Chaguanas West, that will now be 16 members contributing on this. And it is clear that certain things are in definite agreement. We both agree that a child means less than 18 years old, and that's our law in Trinidad and Tobago. On both sides, we agree that child marriage is wrong, and various members have stood up and given their experience, given their opinion on this. I remember the member for Mayaro and his 3 daughters quoting very strongly that he does not want child marriage for his daughters. So if we are clear that the law is that a child is under 18, if we are clear that child marriage is not something we want to promote in Trinidad and Tobago, then we are also clear that there's a need to harmonize our laws in this country to ensure that our laws come together and say the same thing. So when we speak, we are speaking with one voice on the issue of the protection of children. Madam Speaker, the statistics that the Honorable Attorney General made available suggested that there were over 3,000 child marriages in the period 1996 to 2016. And of these, over 1,100 were under the Hindu Marriage Act, while 526 were under the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act. And therefore, it is clear that this issue of child marriage is one that we must address. And I take umbrage when Chaguanas West, the member for Chaguanas West, indicates that this is unnecessary. We don't need to speak about this. We clearly do need to speak about it, and this is something that is continuing in our country. On both sides of the House, we agree, again, Madam Speaker, that there are different approaches to the issue of child marriage. So in some countries, it's a strictly 18-year-old limit that is put. And in some countries, they allow for 16 to 18, special conditions applying to the under 18, between the 16 and 18 age category. In Trinidad and Tobago, what is being put out to the public, what has been discussed with the public, widespread consultations involving all religions, involving the Hindus, the Muslims, the Christians, involving different classes of people in society, young women, young men. I remember the member for Tobago East referencing the consultation in Tobago and what was said by young people and how they put forward their views. 2 rounds of consultations. What has been discussed in this country is harmonizing our laws and ensuring that the people we consider to be children, those under 18, are protected in every law that happens in Trinidad and Tobago, that is passed in Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam Speaker, I want to make it clear, because it seems sometimes like we are speaking only of one religion when we are speaking about child marriage. This bill is speaking about the Hindu Marriage Act, the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, the Orisha Marriage Act, and the Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act, which affects all of us, whether what religion we are, anything in this country, it affects all of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, not just any one religious class of people. Madam Speaker, I remember when this debate began in the other place. The issue seemed to be something different from what it is now. What we were hearing was actual dissent to the whole concept of not allowing children who are under 18 to be married. That was the tone of the contributions in the other house. As a matter of fact, I remember very clearly a temporary senator who referenced when marriage should happen and how marriage could happen. And I remember very clearly puberty being mentioned. And that was the tone of the discussion in the other house. Now, Madam Speaker, as a matter of fact, to the extent that when the bill was passed in the other house, there were 4 UNC senators who abstained from voting on this bill. As a matter of fact, one of them at least was a woman. And that still boggles my mind. Because how could this really be true that a woman would not be voting on such an important bill as this when, Madam Speaker, of those over 3,000 child marriages between 1996 to 2016, 98% of those who were married as children were women. So it is even more disturbing that in the other house, in the first parts of the discussion, 4 senators refused to vote on this, one of them being a woman and all of them coming from the UNC. So that was the tone of that discussion there. But when that hit the public, the outcry was so strong that what we have seen now is a scuttling and a changing of the position. So suddenly, everyone, to a person who stood on the other side to contribute to this debate, agrees that 18 is the age that they would want their children to be married by, not under 18, and every single opposition member is now in agreement with that. In this house, in the other house, there was a different scenario. However, the situation has changed because it seems that in Trinidad and Tobago, we don't have an opposition mature enough to agree with the government when it affects the national good. Because now the situation is, we agree with you, we endorse all you are saying, but it's the constitutionality of what you are doing that now affects us. And that has now been put into the mix as what is stopping the opposition from agreeing and from us demonstrating to the region, as the member for Tobago West would have said, the region is looking on at us, looking on at how long it is taking us to do something so fundamental, something, again, as I go back to Chaguanas West and its description of it as a no-brainer. The region is looking on to see that now we have moved from a position of we don't agree with you to what you're doing, and the way you're doing it is unconstitutional. Madam Speaker, I want to suggest that this whole issue of stopping child marriage, insofar as it affects mainly girls as young and can be as young as 12 years old, as young as puberty, if I were to quote somebody from the other house. This whole issue of stopping child marriages is an issue of protecting our children, protecting our women, stopping child abuse, protecting our most vulnerable in society. If we have a law in Trinidad and Tobago that says penetration of a minor is wrong, and we have passed law in this country that defines a minor as anybody under the age of 18, how then are we discussing this position of 16 and whether or not that is acceptable with certain provisions, Madam Speaker? How then are we discussing that? The member for Chaguanas West mentioned that this bill is about nationalism, respect for each other, that every creed and race can find an equal place. And I rather agree with you. And that is why it is even more disturbing and mind-boggling that we are using issues that have nothing to do with this particular bill to put as stumbling blocks to why we can't just agree to do this to protect our girls and our children. Madam Speaker, this whole issue of, and I want to go to exactly what the member for Chaguanas West would have spoken about, strengthening marriages, recommendations that we strengthen marriage, that we respect religious practices, that reduce sensationalization of sex. These are the things that exactly we are speaking about. And this bill seeks to deal with this one issue. When we bring all sorts of other issues into it, I heard issues brought into this debate such as removing homosexual marriages, common law marriages. I even heard an equation of sex with carnival. And Madam Speaker, I know that many of us enjoy our carnival season in ways that enhance our cultural expression, our cultural immersion. So I need to ask the member for Chaguanas West why this fixation, I've heard him mention it more than once, with equating carnival and sex. I thought carnival was equated with culture in Trinidad and Tobago, and so I don't really understand that collusion. However, what I know is that this bill that we are discussing right now, we can bring in so many issues, but one bill cannot solve all of the problems in Trinidad and Tobago. This bill is meant to deal with a specific problem, that specific problem being that we have a law defining who are children, and we have a marriage act or marriage acts existing that are not in harmony with that. And that is the focus and intent of what we are trying to do here. There will be many other bills that have to be brought to deal with other issues. However, bringing them into this debate, all it really does is stymie the government in its effort to ensure that the young girls are protected in Trinidad and Tobago. Young girls, and who are the ones really that are put into position of being married while they are yet children. Madam Speaker, rape in marriage is something that we recognize as wrong. Not because a husband and a wife are joined by marriage, it means that the man cannot rape the woman. Marriage does not cover that. And so if marrying or penetration of a minor is wrong, I want to suggest in the same way that marriage does not cover or make rape less wrong, marriage does not make child abuse by having sex with a minor less wrong. In the same way. And so we cannot say that in special circumstances it's okay to penetrate a child. In the same way, we cannot say that in special circumstances it's right for a husband to rape his wife. Madam Speaker, we have spent more than enough time discussing this issue. We have gone around it, over it, under it, and we are at the point where the national community is looking to us as legislators to make decisions that would do good for all of the people in this country, so that, as my friend from Chaguanas West said, every creed and race can find an equal place and everyone is treated like an equal person. Our young women are to be protected. Madam Speaker, I have a daughter at the age of 16 right now, and I don't know what circumstances could be put to me to let me think that my daughter at age 16 is ready for marriage, or that she knows exactly what is good for her and therefore she should be married. I don't know what circumstances could be put, and I dare say no member on the other side who has children at that age can really say that they would accept any circumstance put to them that would encourage them to tell their children, it is okay, this is a special circumstance, and yes, go ahead and be married at age 16. I want to say, Madam Speaker, the issue that we are discussing is harmonization of our laws. Penetration of a child under 18 is wrong. Just like rape within marriage is wrong, marriage does not cover it and make it right. It is not a cover for crime. And at this point, it is wrong for us to encourage children to be married and engage in that type of activity. This is a bill about protecting our girls. This is a bill about the sanctity of marriage, ensuring that two adults make a decision to come together in a union that can benefit the both of them. This is a bill that speaks to protection of families, because again, we are putting adults in a situation where they can have children, they can teach their children right values and so on. We are not putting children in a position where they now have to raise children, and we are legislating that that is okay because it's a special circumstance. There's nothing special that makes that okay. Madam Speaker, it is my contention that we need to stop majoring in minors. And I say that, no pun intended. We need to stop majoring in minors. We need to understand that this is a bill that affects all of us, affects our families, affects Trinidad and Tobago, because families are at the heart of the country that we live in. And so, there's no use in opposing just for opposition's sake. At this point, this matter is before us, and what we do sends a message to our children, to our girls, about how we feel about them and how we want to protect them. Madam Speaker, we all have families, and we need to make a definitive statement in passing this bill to protect our children, protect our girls, and protect the national and moral fabric of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Speaker, with these few words, I thank you.
Member for Naparima.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Madam Speaker, we are here to discuss, as has been said before, the Miscellaneous Provisions Marriage Bill 2016 as amended in the Senate, and it amends the Marriage Act, the Chapter 4501, the Muslim Marriage Act and Divorce Act, the Hindu Marriage Act, the Orisha Act, and the Matrimonial Proceedings and Property Act, Chapter 51. But before I get into my presentation, I think I need to respond to some of the comments raised by the member for St. Anne's East. I want to make it abundantly clear to her and to the national community that the position of the United National Congress has always been, with respect to the Marriage Act, that marriage should not take place to someone under 18 years. That is a position that has been articulated very clearly by our political leader even before this debate started. What we did, and what the honourable member for St. Anne's East will never understand, is that we live in a plural, multi-ethnic, multicultural society. And we have in this side decided in the interest of good legislation to give a voice to the voiceless. And that is why. That is the fundamental principle of inclusive democracy that we brought to bear on these proceedings. It is very important that in consideration of this bill, whatever they may think on that side, that it is vitally important that we hear all the views and all the perspectives, so that when we sit and deliberate, we will have a comprehensive, inclusive legislation that reflects the realities of Trinidad and Tobago. And the member for St. Anne's East, I say this also in the context that Trinidad and Tobago is a blessed country. But if we are not careful, we could run into some difficulties. It was Samuel Huntington who said that the next world war is not going to be between nation states, as you had in the Second World War, Germany fighting the Allied forces, etc. He said that the next war is going to be a clash of civilizations. We in Trinidad and Tobago have soldiers fighting in the forefront of the global war on terror. And many are returning as we speak. If we do not manage our multi-ethnic or multi-religious situation, we could run into tremendous difficulties. He said, this is Huntington, that it is my hypothesis that the fundamental source of conflict in this new world will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. Years ago, I worked with Dr. Cuthbert Joseph as a research assistant, and he posited the view that God's great gift to Trinidad and Tobago was to have in this 2,000 square miles of planet Earth the four great philosophies of planet Earth. He was speaking about the Hindu tradition. He was speaking about the Christian European tradition, the Orisha tradition, and the Islamic tradition. Our job here is to listen, synergize, and come up with a transcendental philosophy. But to do that, we have to learn what the side opposite does not learn. We have to listen. We have to listen. We have to understand. We have to internalize. And we don't have to accept totally. So the views of the religious bodies that were presented here was simply that. It's a platform for us to understand their perspective, Madam Speaker. And talking about the clash of cultures, I listened to the contribution, the erudite contribution of my colleague, the member for Tabakit. And he was speaking about the Hindu tradition. And he was positing that in that cultural situation, that there were four stages. And in the 4 stages, he spoke about the student phase, and I was the 4 ashramas. And he was speaking about the first phase as the student phase. And he's saying that is the phase where you prepare for marriage, or you prepare for the householder phase, which is the second phase. And he was positing that that should take about from 0 to 25 years. Right? That is the Hindu tradition. And that student phase is the brahmachara phase. And then he spoke about the grihastha, or the householder phase. And that is from 25, could be up to 40 or 50. And the vanaprasthra, which is the retired phase. And then the sannyasa, which is the renunciation phase, a phase of abstraction, when you do not, when you renounce the things of the world and you cling to God. And I was thinking that philosophy dovetails significantly with the Christian philosophy, and particularly the Baptist philosophy, of which I'm a part. When he spoke about the brahmachara, which is the student phase, it reminds me, and when I turn to my Bible and Luke 41:52, where Jesus, with his parents, and every year they used to go to Jerusalem at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, Jesus was detained, and his parents could not find him, and they were proceeded. And 3 days after, they returned to Jerusalem and asked, "What are you doing here?" And Jesus said, after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. So in the Christian tradition, we also have the brahmachara phase in terms of the learning situation. And that is why we on this side, we are committed and we support. And we have said it before, we have said it ad infinitum, that we support the 18 years for marriage. When my colleague from Tabakit spoke about the phase of detachment, the final phase of detachment, that was synonymous with the Christian faith, where in the final stages, we are supposed to detach ourselves from all the material realities. And if you go to Mark 10, verse 21, when the gentleman asked Jesus, what shall I do to inherit the eternal kingdom? He said, go, sell all your possessions, detachment, and give the money to the poor, and take up your cross and follow me. So here is an example of the synergy of 2 great religions to come up with a philosophy that could inform a marital situation. What can the global philosophy tell us that we could internalize? It's not a question of making law and then saying it is my way or the highway. Take it or leave it, and so be it. I come from the Baptist tradition, and when I look at there's a book by Boise Huggins. Yes, Boise Huggins, The Saga of the Companies, and he spoke he spoke about the marital situation in that tradition, which is some of the things I've inherited from my parents. And he said marriage in the companies formed an important ingredient in the life of the society. Not only was great importance attached to marriage as a social institution, but strict adherence was paid to the formalities which were prerequisite to the consummation of the ceremony. And he said the first step was the proposal, which, if accepted, was followed by parental consent on both sides. This consent was legitimized by writing of a letter requesting permission to visit the home of the girl during the period between engagement and wedding. And if you go on, you could see where it speaks to a parental involvement in the marital process. It speaks to spiritual involvement in the marital relationship, and it spoke to the entire community becoming involved. So it was not a question of passing a law and saying this is going to solve the problem of child marriages or what. And I will want to speak about that question a little later. My colleague spoke about the situation where his mother is performing well in school and she had to withdraw because of an early marriage situation. I had it differently. My mother went to Naparima College. She got married at 21 years. My father was 36, a schoolmaster. And it is because my mother went through that brahmacharya phase, that phase of studentship. It brought a solace and a strength to my family. My father was a very strict person. And if my mother was not strong, if she had not gone through the student phase, then it would have been difficult in our situation. And that is why together with my colleagues, we are committed to age 18 as the minimum age for marriage. But we have to ask the question, while we support this bit of legislation, I get the view, we get the sense that it was not, it is a tunnel vision approach to lawmaking. In essence, and it came across in the contribution of St. Anne's Week, this is it. We have determined it's right. I have a child and I will do this and therefore this is it. And why are you wasting time discussing? Pass the thing and let's get on to the next problem. I looked at what makes good law. And I went to the Cabinet Office and the Office of Parliamentary Counsel of the UK. And it's good law, gov.uk. And I was looking to see what is good law. This is what we're trying to make here. And it says, good law, the Office of Parliamentary Counsel defines good law as laws that are necessary at the time. Is this law necessary at this time? Is it clear? Is it coherent? Is it effective? And is it accessible? I went to the World Justice Project, and they were discussing the rule of law. But the rule of law has many elements. But the elements I was concerned with was the elements of good law. And I'm looking at that in the context of this legislation that we have passed, because I want to make a point subsequently. It says laws are clear, publicized, stable, and just. Just. Are applied evenly. All groups in our society must feel a sense of involvement, a sense of ownership, a sense of participation in our laws. It says, and it must protect fundamental human rights. And we could get into a debate later on about the right of individuals to free choice. We're not going there because we have, as said, we have agreed to the 18 years. It must, and they say these fundamental rights include the security of the person and property and certain core human rights. When I look at this legislation, I get the sense that it is a one-size-fits-all. We have determined in our infinite wisdom that 18 years is the age, and we have done that age when people can make decisions about their bodies and about their choices in life, their lifelong choices. No doubt, my colleague from Chaguanas West spoke about UN legislation, the rights of the child, 18 years, and the CEDAW, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And they have determined 18 years, and we have uncritically accepted 18 years, notwithstanding the circumstances and the diversity that exists in our country. But can we really have one law that fits the totality of the diversity in our country? I go to Lloyd Best. He's one of the people I have an eternal intellectual relationship with. I always seek to dovetail and analyze my views with his. And he says Trinidad is a complex, diverse society, and he identified 9 tribes of Trinidad and Tobago, each of which has its own subcultural context and reality and perspective on the laws that they are forced to operate within. He talked about the Indo-Saxons. I think I know what he is, the rich East Indians. I think it was Mr. Pandey who called them the knife and fork East Indians, with due respect. He spoke about the Afro-Saxons, like my father, the schoolmaster. My father taught at Santa Flora Government School. The President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago was a student. He taught, while he was a headmaster, he taught at San Fernando Government, where former Prime Minister Manning was one of his students. And so he studied in England, and he was an Afro-Saxon. He internalized that concept, and he had a particular perspective that's very different to others in the society. We have the East-West Corridor person, and I think we all know about the subculture. We have the Tobago subculture in Trinidad that is distinct, and I think we all know that the are-we relationship and the significant good that comes out of that that cultural subgroup. We have the Muslims, we have the Hindus, we have the Pentecostalists and the Presbyterians. And he also spoke about the Douglas, a new hybrid group that is coming on our tapestry, all with different perspectives, all that we have to marry together. And if we pass legislation, if we come into Parliament here without taking into consideration their views and perspective, we'll be passing bad law. But if it were Lloyd Best alone, it was Vidya Naipaul. I think it was in the middle passage. I have to be careful because I read those things 30 years ago. The middle passage, he said Trinidad is a confusing society. And he said in the colonial times when they sang the British anthem, God Save Our Gracious Queen, he would say in the cinemas, everybody in balcony would stand up erect and at attention. And in house, half would stand up and half would sit. And in pit, everybody would sit. And he would say that represents the diversity of our society that we have to contend with as parliamentarians. So we have Naipaul and we have Lloyd Best. But even before that, Lord Harris, he was a governor in Trinidad. And you see why in doing legislation, we have to do the necessary research. We have to do the necessary deep analysis in order to come up with the good legislation that I spoke. Lord Harris said in 1846, he became governor in 1846. In a dispatch to London, he remarked about our society that had just been, emancipation had just taken place and a whole group, a race had been liberated. And he said, and I quote, "A race has been freed, but a society has not been formed." So we have a historical set of circumstances. We have some of our intellectuals, people, our writers, telling us we have a complex society that we have to deal with. And I want to make it abundantly clear that we today not discussing forced marriages. We on this side, nobody on this side supports forced marriages. None. And the attempt to conflate the marriage under the age of 18 with forced marriages, we do not accept that false conflation. The bill is not about promoting disproportionate age gaps. In other words, older men trying to use the past legislation to get married to younger girls. In fact, that takes place. That is a cultural situation in Trinidad and Tobago that cannot be dealt with by legislation, because it's going to continue. We have as a society to look at what are the factors factors that create a situation where young girls will, even through coercion by their families or others or their own volition, decide to live with older men. And what remedies should we put in place, legislative and or otherwise, to deal with what I consider a fundamental scourge? But coming back to the question of legislation and this law, my view is that the approach adopted by my friends opposite is the approach that we, the government, we know everything. And I'm getting to a point why I'm making this build-up. They adopt what we call in governance, the social contract theory and the Leviathan approach, that citizens give up all the rights to the state and the government decides for them what is right, and they should have no say, and if they speak, it is a nuisance.
Standing order 48-6, please.
Member, I would ask you now to contain your contribution to what is before you. I want you to be careful with respect to any imputations. Please continue.
Okay, except I just wanted to make the point that there's the John Locke's view that the state exists only to enhance the rights of the citizenry and to protect and to ensure that they could live with peace, harmony, and goodwill. So we come to the question of age. And we see that age is a fluid notion. Right? The age of consent for sexual activity. The minimum marriageable age in Canada is 16. One can join the US military at 17 with parental consent. Many countries accept the age of majority as 18, though it is 19 in some Canadian provinces and territories. So it is not a fixed concept. It is a fluid one. If you go to Alberta, the marriage age is 16, right? But very well prescribed. And that is why I look at the situation in, again, Singapore. I went to the Singapore Government Registry of Marriages website. And let's see how another country dealt with this problem. And that's why I'm saying all we have done is just assume an 18 years, and we have thrown that into the legislation, and we say, that is it, take it. And my colleague from Chaguanas West was asking, what is the empirical data? And show me how this legislation will measurably improve the situation for girls. Let's see what another country did. And they operate on a different, in fact, they are more homogeneous than Trinidad and Singapore is more homogeneous than Trinidad and Tobago. The marriage age in Singapore is 21 years. So they have decided, you see, this is a country that has decided, okay, the UN has said 18, and there are many things with 18. We have decided in Singapore that given our context and given our culture, given our situation, the marriage age should be 21. But there is a provision for marriage as a minor, and they have this on their website. Who must give consent if someone is a minor, that is under 18, under 21, and they want to get married, they can go to the website and they can see what is the process. And they have consent required for marriage of a minor. Circumstances, person or persons whose consent is required. They say where both parents are living. If parents are living together, then both parents must give consent. If parents are divorced or separated by order of the court of agreement, then the parent to whom custody of the minor is committed by order of the court shall give agreement. They give, if one parent has been deserted by the other, they give the circumstances. Who must give approval? This is a serious country that thinks about all the possibilities, all the nuances, and they cater for it legislatively. I'm not saying we should do that, but I'm not saying that we should follow exactly what is prescribed here, but I'm saying the process needs to be understood. They have where one parent is dead, and they give who? The surviving parent. If a guardian has been appointed by the deceased parents, and they talk about the process. So that is where the minor is legitimate. They even have conceptualized the situation where the minor is illegitimate. They say,
all right, so remember, what I would ask you, Zoe, is to relate that
yes, I am.
To the bill. Yes. Okay, because those are not provisions that are before us in the bill?
Yes.
Okay.
But I am saying, Madam Speaker, that while we agree to the 18 years, we must take into consideration the cultural context in which we operate. And therefore, we are talking about incorporating, and how do we go about incorporating our cultural diversity or religious diversity in a legislation such as this. Am I okay with that? Good. They talk about where the minor is illegitimate, and they go on. I wouldn't go into the detail illegitimate, where the minor is illegitimate. But
I get the basic premise, but I'm not certain the relevance of what you're speaking with respect to the premise. And that's why I rose. Okay?
Okay, I understand and I'll be guided. But I would like to indicate what is the... We have said that we would like a process where there must be consent, and it must not be forced, there must be judicial oversight in the process, and it must take into consideration the cultural context. There is an excellent example here, which with your permission, I will just point out as a possibility when we get into reviewing this bit of legislation. It says the application procedure, I'll summarize it. They have a situation where a minor can apply, but he must fulfill certain rigorous criteria. And one of the things is they appoint an officer of the courts and a social welfare officer to investigate the parent separately. And if there's no parent, they have a situation. They investigate with the child separately, both parties. And at the end of the process, they determine whether this is a forced relationship, if it is a coerced relationship, or whether it is a relationship that is entered into by people who are mature. Because they take the view that citizens are important. And while we want to get away from all the instances raised by St. Anne's East, they have developed a counter process that could ensure that people who are mature, people who are young, people who are in love with each other, who want to get married, they can do so. But the courts and the government satisfy themselves that this is a relationship that will endure. The divorce rates in Singapore are significantly lower than in Trinidad and Tobago. So my question is, we have a situation where it works. And in fact, the person, after the minister gives approval, there's 1 month for them to get married. And a judicial officer is appointed for 3 years to assist this couple in ensuring that the relationship works out and that there's no advantage being taken, etc. So here we have a situation where there's an alternative. And I'm saying that we have passed a one law for everybody, every circumstance. There are other possibilities which we could analyze, read, and ignore. But at least we have taken them on board in terms of our analysis. Other countries have done different things. Basically, my point is that we support this legislation. We think that there ought to be a possibility where we can recognize in the legislation the diversity of our culture, where we can take into consideration the views of others that are expressed. Because if we do not do it, what you find is that the legislation is ignored. Like the litter act, people, I see they throw litter. If you put a thing that is strenuous, what is to stop somebody from entering into a cohabitational relationship, which is recognized in Trinidad and Tobago as legal? So the essence, how do we bring all of the citizenry into the legislation? I think, Madam Speaker, that if my colleagues on the other side adopt a posture of inclusiveness, if they adopt a posture of reading and research to get a wider perspective of the legislation, we will not be given legislation. When you benchmark it against other cultures and other countries, you find that there are major deficiencies in the approach that we are taking. So we could go ahead and we could pass, and we will support, provided that there is, provided there is a a recognition that there are other perspectives, other situations that could arise. This has nothing to do even necessarily with religion. It has to do with respect for the individual. We as a government, we as a legislative body must respect the views of the citizenry, take them seriously, help them if there is a problem, and guide them in the path that would redound to the benefit of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much.
Member for Arima.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for allowing me this opportunity to participate in this debate. And I'm also very grateful to be given the opportunity to respond to some of the things that were said by the member for Naparima. Madam Chairman, the member for Naparima spoke about the fact that the UNC is opposed to child marriage. He emphasized the fact that they support marriage that extends over the age of 18. Yet, throughout his contribution, he was contradicting this bill that is now before this House.
That's right, that's right.
Madam President, Madam Speaker, I sat patiently trying to understand what the member for Naparima was saying during this contribution. And the most I can say is that his contribution was riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. Madam Speaker, for almost 30 minutes, he was irrelevant. Almost every point he made had nothing to do with the bill that is now before us. Madam Speaker, he quoted from all sorts of sources. Yes, he quoted about Singapore. I don't know why he has this affection for Singapore. This is Trinidad and Tobago. Our society is different. And he has to understand that. Madam Speaker, I thought that with our association since 1969-68, it would have brought some measure of sense to him. But over the years, he has seemed to have floundered in the wilderness. And I can't understand why today he has the effrontery to stand before this House and speak things that are so irrelevant that they make no sense at all. Madam Speaker, he quoted Naipaul. And in quoting Naipaul, he said that Naipaul said Trinidad is a confusing society. Madam Speaker, his contribution today was confusing, more than confusing. He said that age is a fluid notion. I want to let my good friend from Naparima know that in Trinidad and Tobago, 18 years is the age of adulthood.
Wow.
Madam Speaker, he spoke about what is good law. And he mentioned a good law must be clear, it must be coherent, it must be accessible, it must be stable, it must be just, and it must be applied evenly, and it must protect the fundamental human rights of an individual. Madam Speaker, we on this side contend that this bill meets all of these prescriptions. Oh, yeah. Every one of them. Yes, I'm going to say what you say now. Madam Speaker, in contributing to this debate, I want to anchor my contribution important development goals of the United Nations, of which this country is a signatory. Let's pay attention to goal number 3, that speaks to the desire to ensure healthy lifestyles and to promote well-being for all. And the other goal is to achieve gender equality and empowerment for all women and girls. Let's look at the first goal that I've mentioned, goal number 3, that speaks about allowing children to marry. That talks about ensuring healthy lifestyles and promoting well-being for all. Madam Speaker, allowing or forcing or coercing, whatever term we want to use, children under the age of 18 to marry is not promoting their healthy lifestyle, nor does it promote their well-being. Madam Chairman, to burden a child under 18 with the responsibility of marriage is something that we frown upon. We on this side frown upon that. Because with marriage comes responsibility. And one cannot ask a child, or one should not ask a child, to accept such awesome responsibility when marriage is so important, it is such an important institution in our country. And what happens, what results when we force our children to marry at such a tender age? It encourages abuse, and also it encourages poverty. Because it denies our children a number of opportunities that exist in our education system that this government is providing. Madam Chairman, Madam President, Chairman, President, Speaker, Madam Speaker,
Oversaul, we have 10 more minutes left before the suspension, and it's either you try and contain yourself or I'll invite you to start ahead of us. Okay? Member for Laventille West. A similar invitation is also accorded to you. Member for Arima.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you very much for your protection. Sometimes I feel threatened by when I look across here directly opposite me and I hear the rantings of Cuba South. Sometimes, Madam Speaker, I fear whether he's right there. Yes, I'll proceed, yes. Will we put rest? I know you'll want me to proceed, I know that. Madam Speaker, when we talk about the miseducation opportunities, when we talk about our miseducation opportunities, I would just like to identify some of those that this government and the Ministry of Education have been providing for our children. The Ministry of Education is committed to provide a safe and a nurturing environment for all our children so that learning can take place, effective learning can take place in such an environment. Towards this, we have embarked on a number of initiatives. For example, literacy and numeracy in our school system, where students are carefully monitored to ensure that they are in a position to benefit from what is being offered by our teachers. Madam Speaker, when we look at the performance of our students at the essay examination, we see that there is a need for great improvement in so many of them in these two areas, literacy and numeracy. And as a result, we have embarked on programs that will assist our students in these two areas, starting from infant 1. And that is an opportunity that children in our school system must not be allowed to go by. Secondly, in an effort to ensure that our students benefit, we have instituted a system of clinical supervision.
Speaker, 48-1, please.
Member of Arima, I'll allow you some latitude, but remember we're not dealing here with the education system, and if you could tie the opportunities very quickly into what the basis of the bill is, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I will be so guided. The point I'm making is, when children are allowed to marry at such tender age, they will be missing some very important education opportunities that we have. But I move on. A concern was expressed in the other place with respect to students who might become pregnant. And it was stated that marriage is one of the opportunities that is presented to those students so that they can make a better life for themselves. Madam Speaker, I need to let you know that there should be no fear for persons or children who, through no fault of theirs or through fault of theirs, whatever the circumstances are, if the girls become pregnant, there are certain protocols that we have in place that will assist these students. For example, children are assessed to identify their specific needs. There are necessary referrals made to external agencies, including the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. At the school, we conduct one-to-one sessions to prepare the child to understand what is going on and the types of developments that are not taking place within their bodies. We even advocate for the right of the child in cases where school personnel may have negative feelings about the issue of pregnancy. We provide continuous counseling and development of educational career plans to the students. We give them that type of guidance, and I'll deal with that later. After delivery, the student is allowed to go back to school, either at the same school or at a different school, depending on the circumstances of each case. The student will be offered the opportunity to repeat if it becomes necessary. And the special concessions are given to the student with respect to the student's due date, whether this is close to examination time. We also provide support to these students.
Will the Minister give way to ask a question?
Yes, by all means. Go ahead.
Thank you, Minister. Are these individuals that you're talking about who return back to school, are they under 18 years old?
Yes, I'm talking about students who are under 18, under the age of 18.
That's the fathers could be, there's a criminal act involved there?
Madam Speaker, I'm talking about the support that we give to the students, and I'll come again to talk about the support we also give to the fathers, if the fathers are school children also. And if the father is a school child, he is also provided with guidance and counseling so that he will be better able to deal with that situation. Madam Speaker, there is absolutely no need to rush a child into marriage, regardless of the circumstances. We hold fast, Madam Speaker, to ensuring that our students and our children are able to ensure or to appreciate or to enjoy a healthy lifestyle and to promote, and we try our best to promote the well-being of all. Madam Speaker, I now turn my attention to goal number 5, which I mentioned earlier on, and that is achieving gender equality and empowerment for all women and girls. United Nations goal number 5, again let me stress, of which Trinidad and Tobago is a signatory. We contend that age 13 or age 14 or 15 or 16 or 17, those ages are too tender ages for marriage. Regardless of which adult stands in for the child, as was stated in some quarters, and regardless of whether some adult would give permission, it is our contention that these ages are too tender ages for children to be burdened with the responsibility of marriage. And this is not empowerment. This is really taking away from the child the right to decide for herself, or perhaps for himself.
Honorable members, it's now 4:30. This House is now suspended. We shall resume at 5 o'clock.